meine Freiheit, ja, ich will ja meine Freiheit haben, so dass ich wohnen kann, wo ich will.
Jesteśmy prawdziwi prawicowcy.
Buonasera, buonasera e benvenuti a questa intervista, una delle ultime interviste del 3070 DocFest. Quest'anno abbiamo 7 documentari in competizione e ne stiamo per incontrare uno particolare, un film che non è solo un reportage, ma è un'indagine attraverso gli archivi cinematografici e fotografici della British Petroleum Archives. E abbiamo qui quindi la regista che chiamo qui con me. So, welcome Sanaz SOHRABI.
Hello,
welcome.
everyone.
Hello, where are you now?
I'm in Chicago now. Just came from Montreal last weekend.
Okay, cool. And I'm from Vittorio, Veneto now, so I wish you could be with us this weekend at the festival that is from the 19th to the 21st of November. And at the end, we could enter in the cinema and watch properly your film and also the other films in competition. And I would like to ask you just to present yourself, since you're not just simply a director, a filmmaker, but you are also coming from the art scene and the art field. So if you want to just present yourself as what you did, I saw that you did also other 2 films, always strictly connected with the archives and this kind of narration.
Thank you so much to everyone at the festival for the labor that has gone into putting the festival online and physical. My name is Sanaz SOHRABI, and I'm an artist and filmmaker, as also described by Viviana. I just want to mention there is a playback of my own voice. I don't know if it can be fixed.
Okay. I don't know from where this can. Maybe it just.
Yeah, I think that's better. At least, yeah, perfect. Thank you so much. It's really hard to focus. Yeah, I'm an artist and filmmaker, and as dear Viviana explained, I think the background of visual arts really shows itself in the film itself, the way it's written, the way the images are sutured and narrativized together. And in general, in terms of the methodology of working with the archives is really connected to my background, educational background and training, and particularly because I've been trained in photography. And that's my educational background in particular is around photography and history of photography. So it's really deeply connected to that visual arts education. One Image, Two Acts is a mid-length film that I finished in 2020, but the research behind it was about 3 to 4 years. That was also part of my doctoral project that I've started in 2017. So One Image to Acts is the first film from a trilogy of films that I'm envisioning for this project to be. And as you mentioned, it primarily deals with the British Petroleum Archives, and in particular looks at the photography and film production of Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which later became British Petroleum, or what we know currently as British Petroleum, as this energy company. And I came across these archives actually through a film scholar, Mona Damluji, who has done extensive work on Iraq Petroleum Company and the films that were produced in Iraq. And when I read her essays and her work on Iraq Petroleum Company, I was really stunned to really know the history of photography and film production of BP in Iran for a good half of the 20th century. And that sort of like became my doctoral project, actually. I started to work on it extensively and did field work at the BP, and really was really fascinated by understanding the relationship between photography and film as technologies of eradication themselves that worked in tandem with the extractive industry, and really thinking about the archives that have remained from the company's operations for over half a century as both evidences and witnesses to the company's colonial project, but also as a form of technology itself. The archival regime that has created and has left behind is in itself a form of a visual machine that allows us to see and also silences many stories, many different timelines, many different bodies that have been silenced along the way for many years that the company was operating. So the BBC archive was a major part of the project, but as you see in the film, I was really interested in creating a form of counter-narrative to BP's visual regime of extraction, visual regime of petromodernity. I was really interested to see where can I locate the stories, oral stories, other visual regimes that they also grappled with this idea of petromodernity, with this idea of really violent modernization through petroleum industry. So, and that's where I located that form of counter-visuality in the works of Amir Naderi, a very influential Iranian film director, and Ebrahim Golastan's films that he produced for the National Iranian Oil Company. I was really interested to think about what oil points at, because the British Petroleum's archive gives this illusion of what oil should look like, what petromodernity is going to look like, and what is the petroleum fueled future. And I was also really interested to see what other forms of futures were imagined, what futures were eradicated within this economy and this really collateral economy around oil and petroleum. And to just give some information about my work with archives at large and how I work with archives, as you mentioned, also I have created a lot of different short film essays that work with different photographic archives, whether they are media archives, national archives, found footage, or things that they don't necessarily count as archive per se. I'm really interested in that, in what constitutes an archive, and whether it's a monument, a cemetery, a museum, something that has been long forgotten in a media archive, and really try to bring them together and suture them through a narrative, through the interplay between image and text, and through the recreation of the photographs, whether it's printing them large in different sizes, cutting them up, putting them back together, refilming them, and creating a cycle rather than a linear progression of time, of narrative. So as you see, I create a lot of collages in the film, and for me, this creation of negative and positive space in the image was one way to really dissect its original sort of like colonial construct that was so homogenized, was so tailored, was so sanitized, and really try to dissect that embedded rigidity that was sort of like in the fabric of these visual materials and these images.
Also with the using of this also printing materials, so that you cut it and then these overlays, right?
Yeah, exactly. So for those images, I printed them quite large. They were about like maybe 3 meters tall, so they were quite large in the space. And I printed them on really a cheap bond paper, which is used for test printing in the photo lab that I'm a member of, and also regularly is used for architectural prints. So it was a very thin paper. It doesn't have much weight, so it flows really nicely. And I had this idea back in my head. Actually, I have a little sketch here in my studio, so I'm gonna just like show it to you. It's kind of fun. I had this thing that I had made, like, and it was just like in front of my computer for quite like 2 years, and sort of like I had no idea that this thing will make it into the film, like this way of like just cutting. And this is really small, as you see, and again, it speaks to I think that it speaks to how artists usually work in their studio, that you sketch and you put things together. They may not necessarily be sort of like part of a script per se, but they find themselves in the film, in the final project, in these fortuitous ways. So yeah, I actually when I thought about making this backdrop, I had completely forgotten about these sketches I had made like a year prior. So it was really interesting for myself. It's like, oh my God, this actually had been in my head. So it was a nice sort of lingering, if you will, in the studio. And one thing that originally when I was working with these sketches was I was thinking about shredding papers in office spaces, and how some documents are shredded to be disregarded, like usually classified documents, if you will. You know, they I want to speak to that quality and to that sense in the archives too, that at the end of the day, they have a certain bureaucracy embedded in them, like that I thought this shredding will speak to that.
I really like to show also all these pictures that it's easily found in your website, where you can see all these papers you use for the set. And also I was pretty curious about the films you were screening at some point. There's two other films, right? One from Golejan and the other Naderi, right? Mm-hmm. And at the end, he's also speaking, right?
Yeah.
And how was this relation and the meaning of this, of course?
I came across Ibrahim Golestan's film when I was doing the research. Of course, I knew about Amin Adar's film. The Runner is a very iconic film. And it's a very important film. It's a masterpiece in many ways. And Amin Adar, he himself is from Abadan, and I came across his interview that Zahra Amir Ebrahimi had done in BBC. There was this clip that I came across that is part of it is in the film. On Twitter, actually, someone had shared this audio clip, and when I was listening to this clip, I just felt this rush of emotions when he was talking about The Runner, when he was talking about how he filmed it during the war, and this notion that he patched this his own memory from the city he grew up in. And through this filmic language and this idea of montage of a city, it was really Benjaminian in a way, that he had these flash-like memories of the city. And to me, this back and forth from what you recall and what is right in front of you was really emotional, was really actually speaking to the very condition I was dealing with at hand while I was working with the archives, because I had been working with the photo archives for almost 3 years at the time. So, you know, I had seen all these images, all these photographs, and I would find myself be really hooked by certain faces, by certain places. And they had this haunting quality to them, this spectral quality, that they had a lingering effect. So to me, this idea that these images have this ghostly quality, this haunting quality to them. And for me, the way not that he spoke about the runner, the way he saw a form of a struggle within the petroleum fueled economy, and how this character that he had created was really a hero, a form of a protagonist that is trying to make it no matter what, and is not nagging, is really trying to make it. To me, it really spoke to the lingering effect that I had encountered as I was working on the BP archives, and again really spoke to this sort of a counter narrative around oil, around modernity, around seeing oil as not only a commodity, but as a form of social relation, as something that penetrates the cinematic language very differently. For instance, in Iranian New Wave, in many works that Iranian directors have made after the nationalization of oil, this film in particular really stands out for me, because it's a film that is not commissioned by the oil company. You know, it's not a commissioned documentary, but it is so deeply connected to the oil towns in the South West. It's so deeply connected to the time and place it was filmed during the Iran-Iraq War, and in many ways really is entangled to the economy of oil, both visually and politically, in a really striking manner. And I thought that is the perfect ending to this film, that how the film is started and how I wanted it to end. Really were two different sort of like end of the story in a way. I started with not with Iran, I started with Syria, I started with a very strange geography in the US, and with a very different colonial timeline, with a different colonial story. And then I ended it with Iran-Iraq War, which stands out as one of the sort of the endings of many things, the ending of the OPEC's project, the ending of the South-to-South sort of anti-colonial solidarity, Iran and Iraq being two founding members of the OPEC, and then finding themselves in being in this 8-year collateral war. So the ending in itself has a lot of different endings embedded in it, right? So for me, this is starting and the ending really was really personal also. There were moments in the project that really were never planned to be the beginning of the film and the ending of the film, but they really stood out in the project. They became this moment that really anchored me and anchored the project in this very meaningful way and revealing manners. So that's how they found themselves to be in the beginning and the end.
It's also interesting for me, the beginning, as you were saying, so that there's this grave with this image of this country. So tell me more about this, if you want to say something about this, since you used, as you said, different, of course, different tools, and also starting from a grave. No, it's not so. It's not a kind of starting point. It's kind of the end.
Exactly. Yeah. So the grave stands as this really important piece in the film in multiple ways. For one, what constitutes as an archive? Can we say this grave is an archive itself? Yes, I think this is an archive. It stands for a history. It stands for a history way larger than what it represents. And on the other hand, when we look at it, it's about a form of it's about a colonial protagonist. It's about this person who was a form of energy entrepreneur, if you will, in our current sort of way, if we were to characterize this person, James Manhall. So someone who went to Syria in order to excavate oil, and he was actually commissioned by the government at the time. But nonetheless, the narrative is very similar to many other colonial narratives. In Iran, there was also an Australian energy investor who got different loans from the British government, and he's from his personal funds, and he excavated for oil for many years in Iran until he struck oil. So in a way, there were many of these figures, these characters that they recur in many different countries, that they went through this process of becoming sort of like resource facets for different oil and energy companies. So in a way, James Manhall was a character, was a historical character, but also there are many people like him that operated in different countries. And on the other hand, just the fact that he went on to engrave the whole map of Syria on his grave stands as a very peculiar and curious thing. Was it as a way for him to attach himself to the history of oil excavation in Syria forever, as a way for him to leave a mark, as a way to own that history, as a way to lament it, as a way to leave a trace? And it is a trace. The map itself is a trace. The engraving is a trace. But yet the history of him is so mysterious, at least in terms of like the things that I have found about him. It's very mysterious. So that in itself was really peculiar for me, and it spoke to another way to think about what we see and what is not there in the archive. Because for me, I saw this grave, I saw this engraved map of Syria, I saw this engraved oil derrick, but yet I could not see much of the history of it, but there was some tracing. So again, that relationship between what is there in the archive for you to see, what is absent, what are the gaps, what are the contradictions. So I think that grave itself really spoke to that, really embodied that contradiction in the archive. And again, the other thing is that usually archives are considered as dead matter, right? I mean, what could be the most like irony that this tomb is on the grave of a dead person, right? So I think this sort of like coupling of all these things that I was thinking about of archive really all came together in this really simple grave, and in this really unlikely place, because Southern Illinois is a really strange place to begin with. And I never thought that this map will be there in this really strange place. And yeah, and I've always wanted to extend what constitutes an archive in my work at large. And I thought starting the film with the grave again really allows me to propose that question once again, that what constitutes an archive, and how can we propose different places, different sites, different stories as archives.
Wow, I want to know more also about his life now. So next film, maybe. What about your next projects? And what are you working on, and what's your next film that we're going to watch?
Thank you. I hope I can make it work. I'm working on two projects. I'm working on a short piece tentatively titled Extractable Frame that works also with some of the BP film archives toward the end of BP's operations in Iran. early 1950s, before the sort of like mass exodus of the British personnel from Iran. I'm working on a series of piled footage that were filmed for future documentaries. So this idea of like, let's take B-rolls so we can later edit them into different sort of newsreels or oil propaganda for the company. So I'm working on those footages, and but that's a shorter piece. And I'm working on what it means to monetize an archive, and these archives are some of them are heavily monetized, meaning they're really expensive to purchase them. So I'm really working on how these archives yet again are part of another imperial archival regime, copyright regime, that for you to access them, you have to pay this exuberant amount of money for you to access them. And the longer project, sort of another, I think it will be their mid-length or feature that looks at the transnational visual cultures of oil that were so prevalent and so so common to produce by different states, that they had gone through the nationalization process between the 1950s and start of 1980s. So I'm working on OPEC, actually, like the transnational visual culture of different OPEC member states, and how each of them imagined this idea of national oil that was so personified to represent their own nation, but at the same time, that same sort of like oil was meant to unify all the other nations that were part of the OPEC as a form of cultural project, as a form of political project, right? So this idea that oil was tasked to unify people above it, like this idea that this material, this subsoil, is personified through film culture, through visual culture, through media publication, to unify people above it transnationally, is really fascinating. And I've been working on gathering a large series of archives that I've been collecting personally, to really understand in how many ways and in what ways oil was tasked with this idea of unification and solidarity, and what were the promises, what were the hopes and failures of that oil-anchored solidarity, if you will. And it didn't really go well, you know, as we've seen in Iran-Iraq war. And in my narrative that I've sort of like been working on, the start of the Iran-Iraq war was actually the end of that sort of transnational solidarity around oil and OPEC's project, because OPEC is often personified in sort of like Western Europe and North American narrative as a form of economic cult. It's very cult sort of driven, the narratives around it. And I wanted to kind of like change that a little bit. Not that OPEC is sort of like the revolutionary force that is going to create justice and equality for all, but to think about OPEC within that framework of global decolonization between 50s and 70s, within the non-aligned movement, within other tricontinental cultural and political projects. If we look at OPEC from that perspective, it really brings a whole other way of thinking about oil, about stories around oil and what went wrong, how things were imagined, how future was imagined through oil, and what do we do with them now, especially at this moment that everyone tries to historicize oil in order to imagine a post-petroleum future, imagine to get rid of the century of petroleum fuel century and try to imagine otherwise. So I think at this point in particular, it's really important to think about OPEC, to think about that project of transnational solidarity around oil, and what futures were already destroyed, what futures we can imagine. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. And I want to see your next film for sure. And we are here also next year for sure for this. And we hope that we can host you in the next future for sure. And I'm gonna thank you very much to be here with us. And I would like to remember to everybody that we're gonna be in the cinema in Multisala Cinema Verdi in Vittorio, Veneto from 19 to the 21st of November. And then we're going to be online. I'm going to switch to Italian for who's going to stay here until the end. Quindi io vi ringrazio tutti voi che avete seguito questa intervista. Vi ricordo che la proiezione di One Minute to Act sarà domenica sera, domenica 21 alle ore 7, e quindi vi aspettiamo al cinema e speriamo, insomma, successivamente dopo questa proiezione ci saranno anche le premiazioni, quindi scopriremo chi vincerà anche il festival. Grazie infinite, thank you very much Sanaz SOHRABI to be here with us, and see you soon.
Thank you. Ciao. Ciao.
Ich will einfach meine Freiheit, ja, ich will ja meine Freiheit haben, so dass ich wohnen kann, wo ich will.